Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video is a fantasy recommendation style video, which is by far and away my most requested type of video in general, so I'm so excited to put it together for you. Today's video is really going to be oriented to like great places to start in fantasy. Basically, I'm going to be giving recommendations for fantasy novels based on your favorite genre. So if your go-to genre is thrillers, I have a recommendation in fantasy for you. Romance, mystery, historical fiction, I have a book to cover them all. I'm hoping this video is helpful and a great way to kind of introduce you to some fantasy stories if you don't often read it. But without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. First genre I'm going to be recommending a book for is thrillers. If you love dark, intense, gripping, twisty, turvy stories, often centering some sort of diabolical serial killer, I have the perfect fantasy recommendation for you, and that is Helm of Midnight by Marina Lostetter. In a lot of ways, this is like if a thriller and a fantasy novel had a baby. It's the perfect combination of genres that makes it impossible to put down. This story is set in a fantasy world where a lot of the magic is centered around objects. Particularly, there are these things called masks, which basically can be imbued with memories and skills of individuals they're able to leave right before they die. So basically, a famed surgeon can put all of his skill within a mask, and now anyone can put it on and kind of be able to harness that skill set. But many years ago, a mask was made not under the supervision of the government of a very legendary serial killer, and this mask has been under the protection of the government ever since. But at the beginning of this book, a deadly heist occurs and this mask is stolen. Now the killing moniker of the serial killer are beginning to grace the streets once again. We follow a variety of characters, kind of an individual plot lines and storylines, and one of our main characters is actually a regulator, and her job is to basically investigate and prevent certain types of magical outbreaks. So she is on this case of trying to locate this missing mask and also try to catch them from killing anyone else in the future. But we also have some other POVs that are kind of unclear how they're directly connected. It's all very enticing, very dark, full of murder and mystery, and it's just so intense. If you love thriller stories, this is a fantastic fantasy book to check out, I promise. The next genre I'm going to be recommending for is romance. It's no secret that fantasy and romance is probably one of my all-time favorite intersections or combination of genres. I love a magical, mythical forest, and I love a charming good time of watching two people fall in love in an unexpected time and place. So this was actually pretty hard to narrow down for me. I have a whole video recommending fantasy romance, which I'll leave linked down below. But for this video, I've decided to go with Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. This is a standalone fantasy novel that is just one of my all-time faves, from the writing to the characters to the storyline. Like, everything about it is so gripping. Plus, it has a really intoxicating and gripping romance also very centrally at the heart of it. But this is actually a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin, and it's set in Russia sometime maybe in the 14th, 15th, or 16th century. We follow a few different girls and we kind of watch their lives intersect. The first main character is Miriam. Due to her family's profession and the fact that they are Jewish, she is largely ostracized by the community at large, and her father is not really considered a good moneylender, as he has a very soft heart and tends to extend people's loans at the expense of their family. At the beginning of this book, Miriam decides to basically take her father's business underneath her own hands and kind of makes maybe one too many promises, one of them being that she can turn thread into gold, which makes her cross paths with this magical individual. And the other main character we follow is the daughter of a relatively powerful family within Russian society, but given that she's not considered traditionally beautiful, her worth has been boiled down to being nothing, and she's very poorly treated by her family. However, at the beginning of this book, her family has sort of cracked this plan to get her connected to the Tsar. He and also this particular plot is much more dangerous than it seems on the outside. Again, this is a story so much about these incredible female characters, but there's also a sprinkling of romance wrapped up in one of the most beautifully written books ever. This is also a great historical romance fantasy option, so if you want a third subgenre, historical fantasy as well. So I just feel like this is a great book for if you love romance, it's a great book if you love fantasy. It's a wonderful book all in all. The next genre I'm going to focus on is slice of life. Interestingly enough, while I don't generally read a lot of contemporary fiction, I love watching slice of life content, movies, TV show. I love media that focuses on these just slices of one's life, these moments of watching someone really intimately. And if you love these types of stories or media, I would really recommend the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb. Obviously, we know I'm basically a professional Robin Hobb fangirl at this point, but I feel like the Farseer trilogy is basically slice of life fantasy. This is a story where we follow one character intimately from the beginning of their life through much of their adolescence into early adulthood. We see their hopes, we see their dreams, we see them have to confront and make hard decisions. And so much of this book is just following Fitz, our main character, as he goes about his daily life, his training. Yes, there's some political conspiracy woven in there. Yes, there's some dramatic moments of life and death, what is going to happen. But ultimately, the charm of this series, and the charm, in my opinion, of a lot of Robin Hobb's books, are her characters and how well situated you are within their lives. I was just as gripped watching Fitz go about his chores and him contemplating his feelings within that moment as I was as he went out on a quest or began to learn the tools of a trade of becoming an assassin. This series is incredible. It's also just so well paced, slow and methodical, but so intimately worthwhile. I love the Farseer trilogy so much, and to me, this is a perfect option. The next genre I'm going to be recommending a book for is historical fiction, which I would argue is probably my second favorite genre. So I especially love when fantasy and historical fiction kind of cross paths. Historical fantasy or historical story with just a dash of fantasy is some of my favorite books out there. The book I'm going to recommend today is a more recent read that absolutely captured me from page one, and that is She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. This is described as like Song of Achilles meets Mulan. This is a queer and fantastical reimagining of the founding emperor of the Ming Dynasty, and it is sweeping. It's full of war and politics, and it's just so expertly crafted, and the historical setting and influence is integral not only to the plot, but is truly my personal favorite part of this book. But in this story, we follow our main character Zhu, and the book itself opens on a famine-stricken village, and we follow Zhu and her family as they're struggling to survive the next day. Zhu, being the only girl in the family, is kind of regulated to the background. She watches as her brother receives a fortune telling him that he is going to have a great destiny. Unfortunately, as war continued to spread across the land, it results in the passing of everyone in Zhu's family but her. So she decides to take upon her brother's destiny for herself, basically disguising herself as him and also claiming this fate, this life that she was never even given the opportunity to have. We follow her as she receives her education and also gets wrapped up in rebellion in the land. It is so good, just the historical ambiance and setting, this character development with Zhu. Not to mention there's so many compelling relationships and interesting character dynamics and conversations around identity and queerness, all situated in the 14th century. This book is excellent. It's so good. For sure, one of the best historical fantasy releases in my opinion, and I love it so much. Next genre I have a recommendation for is literary fiction, and this obviously is a really broad umbrella, but when I think of literary fiction, I usually think of tales that not only sit with me, make me think, but often have a very unique sort of point of view, either from like the writing style, the formatting, like something about it is quote unquote literary, like you want to write a paper about it. And to me, there's like a quintessential fantasy series that I have read that I constantly go back to and recommend for that I feel honestly fits into this so perfectly. Apologies if I talk about this series too much, but I'm actually not that sorry. The book I'm going to recommend is The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. This is just one of the most unique and profound fantasy stories I've ever read. Each book won the Hugo Award in fantasy. So obviously, I'm not the only one who thinks this series is excellent and incredible. Aside of the actual plot being riveting and fascinating and just so entrancing you're unable to put it down, but the actual structure and literary point of view of this book is incredibly unique. The first book is primarily told in second person, which I would say, one, usually not a big fan of the use of second person in a book, and also I just really haven't encountered that very much when picking up stories, and N.K. Jemisin's use of this perspective is so successful, in my opinion, that it's just one of the coolest, most unique stories I've ever read across any genre. But this is a fantasy trilogy set in a world where calamity is constantly occurring. Basically, the end of the world is happening, civilization is ending and rebuilding itself over and over again. Due to this, communities have kind of evolved to have very specific roles to ensure that at least something survives once the world ends once more. There's also magic wielders in this world who are actually able to harness the power of the earth themselves, but instead of being lauded as possible heroes, they're looked at with a lot of scrutiny and suspicion, and in fact are actually deeply controlled by the government itself. In this first book, we follow three different characters. First, a mother on the run trying to find her missing daughter, a young girl who's just discovered her powers, and third, a apprentice who's basically kind of come into their powers and is just starting to work for the government. This is just, again, one of the most unique books I've ever read from a true literary point of view, from a plot point of view, and just also one of the best fantasy books I've ever read. And I feel like if you love literary fiction, this is a great book to check out. Next genre on the list is horror. Definitely one that I'm a bit of a scaredy cat for, but I do feel like its application in the fantasy genre can create some really fun scenarios, and oftentimes paranormal or fantasy elements in horror stories is pretty common. But my particular recommendation for this is Middle Game by Seanan McGuire. This is a really fun, very gruesome, very intense urban fantasy story following two siblings, Roger and Dodger. This story sort of takes place over a rather large swath of time, but basically the opening idea is that there's this alchemic organization, the secret organization that has been plotting to take control of the world in one way or another, like gain ultimate power. And then we sort of flash to these two characters, Roger and Dodger, who are two very gifted children who are also twins, but they were separated at birth. Dodger is incredibly skilled in mathematics, where Roger is incredibly skilled in language. Try as they might, they tried to keep these two children apart, but they constantly sort of found each other throughout different pivotal moments of their life. And at some point, they also realized the existence of this alchemic group, and they sort of have to work together to possibly prevent like the destruction of the world. It's fascinating. It really plays with time. Also, it's often set on like university campuses, and just these sort of genius main characters are honestly very fascinating. We're shifting through a huge variety of points of view. Many of them are quite devious and evil and horrifying, as you would expect. This book is gripping and diabolical. I read it one year like near Halloween, and it was perfect vibe. So if you're looking for Halloween 24/7, this is a great book to pick up. And then the last genre I'm gonna recommend a fantasy book for is kind of like crime, adventure, sort of series. Like if you love political thrillers or like organized crime, mob situations, this is the book I would recommend, and that is Jade City by Fonda Lee. Another book that I feel like is a really great place to start in the fantasy genre if you're newer to fantasy. This is an Asian-inspired urban fantasy story set in the fictional land of Kekon, which is primarily ruled and controlled by two major crime families. And the way that they're able to maintain this control, not only on this place, but also be heavyweights internationally, is their use and control of the production of something called jade. Jade in this land and culturally able to be worn and used by certain individuals. If you're able to harness the power of jade, you're basically faster and stronger than the guy next to you. And this particular resource is highly regulated, as you would imagine. This particular story is multi-POV, and we basically follow one of those crime families very closely, and we follow a variety of perspectives primarily within their organization. Different characters ranging not only in role, expectations, and also feelings about the family itself. There's also some other characters that are revolving outside of the family, but things really begin to heat up when the Cold War that sort of existed between these two families begins to heat up again. This is like a crime family story taking place over many, many years throughout the entire trilogy. Obviously, there is a fantastical component, especially with this substance jade, which has kind of magical properties to it. This series to me is much more like a family drama saga, a story that's much more about politics, international and local, as well as organized crime. If you like any of those things, I highly recommend checking this book out. And I also am really looking forward to the TV show adaptation that's coming out. I'm counting down the days. One of my all-time favorite series, and I truly think You will love it. Alrighty guys, that is my, if you like this genre, here's a fantasy book to check out. Please let me know down below some recommendations you think fit really well in these genres, or some other genres you perhaps want recommendations for, as I would love to know. And I will see you guys soon with another video soon. Goodbye.